All right, 2 minutes past the hour. I know that many people are likely to join, given that it has been a packed couple of days at the conference. Welcome everybody to this interactive session on how highly resourced individuals can support systemic changes in society. My name is Odin Mühlenbein. I'm a partner at Ashoka Germany, and yeah, thrilled to welcome you to this interactive session. It's based on the report Influence for Good that we will share later in the session. It's a joint publication by Ashoka, Catalyst 2030, Echoing Green, Generation Pledge, and McKinsey. Before we get started, let me quickly go through the speakers and the agenda for you before I hand it over. The next slide, please. So we will have Liza Müller from Echoing Green. She will be talking about why it's important to engage highly resourced individuals, especially now. Paul Ziesche from McKinsey will give us a concise, quick summary about the key findings of the report. Jerubali Moria, a social entrepreneur, will talk about what leaders of social change are actually expecting from highly resourced individuals and what they need. Finally, Marina Pfeffer from Generation Pledge will be running a fireside chat with Farhad Ibrahimi from the Skoll Foundation on the perspective of highly resourced individuals and why they think they should engage with everything they have, basically, in a way that we will describe in a moment. The only perspective in the report that we haven't covered here in the speakers is that of philosophers and social justice scholars, but I can assure you we talked to them too, and the good news is that everybody agrees. After the fireside chat, we will have some time for a little personal reflection session, so we hope that you will stay on for that. It's going to be interesting. Now, with that, let me hand it over to Liza on some context about why this topic is so important right now.
Hi, and thanks, Odin. So I'm Liza Miller. I'm the Vice President of Thought Leadership and Knowledge at Echoing Green. And at our organization, we believe it's part of our mission to engage more individuals in the movement for systems change. And that despite the fact that we're best known for selecting and supporting early stage social innovators, we spend a lot of time and effort considering how we can support people who are not social innovators themselves to use all of the assets at their disposal to contribute. Echoing Green believes that everyone has a role to play in the movement for systems change. For some people, that role might be primarily to participate with their incredibly valuable time and talent. But for others, when that individual could be considered a highly resourced individual, that's someone with considerable wealth and a general ability to influence social, business, and political circles.
Oh, and she was talking.
The call to action is different. Oh, I think we have somebody go on mute. Thanks. Like I was saying, for other individuals, the call to action is different. We know this, our fellows know this, my colleagues on this panel know this. It's so crucial that we activate these highly resourced individuals if we're going to make significant progress towards lasting and sustainable systems change. Some might suggest that highly resourced individuals have been activated. But if we use the global racial justice response over the last 2 years as a case, the Philanthropic Initiative for Racial Equity found that the resulting funding surge did not translate to significant funding for the kind of grassroots organizing that generated an unprecedented response to racial justice in the first place. So what does activation that brings support to the full spectrum of systems change leaders actually look like? The president of Echoing Green, who a lot of you will know, she's also my boss, Cheryl Dorsey, she will often quote Frederick Douglass when she talks about this. She says, Frederick Douglass said, "Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will." The social innovation community has demands. If you're at this conference, you have demands. You want to see system change accelerate. You want to see the future be wildly different from the present and the past. And so we're looking for action. We are calling for highly resourced individuals to go beyond allyship and philanthropy. At Echoing Green, we lean on the words of Alicia Garza, the founder of the Black Lives Matter movement, when we talk about this. She talks about the need for more co-conspirators. If we're going to make meaningful, lasting progress towards racial justice, towards system change, more highly resourced individuals need to become co-conspirators. She says that allyship is mostly closely associated with language, while co-conspiracy is about taking responsibility for the power that we hold to transform our conditions. Being co-conspirators represents a muscular and shared form of civic engagement that we need now more than ever. So how does this all relate to this session and this report? Well, over the last year, the folks that you see on the speakers for this panel have been engaged, and their organizations have been engaged in a research initiative to learn more about how we might best activate more highly resourced individuals through the creation of framework and guides to how they can significantly contribute with and far beyond their wealth with their personal influence. This research was done through extensive interviews with highly resourced individuals, alongside social entrepreneurs and experts in ethics and philanthropy. It explores motivational drivers, pathways to ethical usage of influence, power sharing, and the forms of what we are calling polycapital, the 4 forms of capital that make up a person's sphere of influence. We believe that these guides can help create more co-conspirators to grow and evolve the movement for systems change and make progress towards global equity and sustainability. I'm going to turn it over to my fellow panelist, Paul, who's going to talk more about the report findings and further frame the conversation we're having with you all today.
Thank you, Liza. So I'm Paul Ziesche. I'm a consultant at McKinsey Company. I'm currently dialing in from Berlin. And I have the pleasure to summarize the findings of this report that is actually part of a multi-year effort. So in 2019, we started publishing our yearly report series on systemic change. The first report published in 2019, From Small to Systemic, focused on quantifying the economic value of systemic change, followed by Embracing Complexity, that focused on how to fund for systemic change, particularly focusing foundations, while we turn to governments in the report that was published last year, New Allies. This year, we published a report on highly resourced individuals, as already introduced by Liza, and particularly focusing on how individuals can use their influence that comes with careers, with economic funds, with social connections and the likes to support and forward systemic change further. We go to the next page. The fundament of the work was kind of starting from a compounding set of crises that we see in the world. They are putting social coherence at risk. Like some quite timely examples are still the COVID-19 pandemic. We see unevenly distributed climate change impacts unfolding and growing global and local inequalities. What we believe in is that systemic change can be a very powerful tool to alleviate these crises, by addressing root causes and eliminating problems where they start to exist instead of throwing resources at treating symptoms. But what we see when we look for how resources are currently used in the philanthropic scene and beyond that is that the majority actually goes to mitigation, which is not to say that mitigation isn't important. It is very important, but we see a strong imbalance in how these resources are currently distributed. We go for the next page. We see that actually big philanthropists are very interested in systemic change. First of all, philanthropy is the #1 top priority for highly resourced individuals. And 80% of major philanthropes quote fundamental betterment of the system as one of their core goals. So it's like even more surprising in a sense that we see the strong difference in how resources are allocated. And I think the most the closest explanation for that probably is that working towards systemic change is actually really hard, and it's difficult to achieve true change. So what we try to do in this report, we try to give a practical guideline that is oriented along highly resourced individuals. We already named them before, but here we give the definition. So we have individuals with outsized influence through wealth, through networks, reputation, or general ability to influence social, business, and political circles. And what we try to do is use these individuals as a guideline to formulate principles on how to work towards systemic change that are generally applicable to individuals with access influence. So it's not necessarily limited to highly resourced individuals, but it was kind of the easiest and the most pressing section to address here. For the next page, we see that for those we interviewed, Lisa already mentioned that we conducted around 50 interviews for this effort alone, let alone the hundreds of interviews for the reports of prior years. But what we found this year in particular was that 75% of our interviewees reported a sense of purpose, belonging, and liberation from their work, and over 80% perceived a moral duty on top of that. We will hear from Farhad Ibrahimi in a second, and one thing that really stood out to me in my interview with him was his emphasis on how his liberation is deeply connected to everyone else's liberation, like kind of bringing to point what you understand by saying there's a sense of purpose, belonging, liberation, and moral duty at once. So what we found as well is that the moral duty, the perceived moral duty, scales with 4 factors. The first one being benefit. So individuals reported that their moral duty was higher the more they benefited from unjust systems. The second one was their ability to know their contribution to it, like either in the present, most likely in the past, through their personal conduct, through how their wealth was acquired, through how their companies interact with the world, like a whole bunch of different interaction points. And thirdly, we have the ability. So individuals reported the more available resources are for them to actually change something, they felt more obliged to do so. And the fourth factor would be the urgency. So the more urgent any topic was, the more there was a moral duty to act. On the next page, we have important leadership in terms of expert guidance. We wanted to emphasize that, as we see that a lot of HRIs we interviewed heavily relied on not working on their own, but actually working in community. And we have proximate leaders on the one hand who provide contextual wisdom. They have firsthand experience as they are part of the in-group of issues that are addressed. They hold practical wisdom because they usually have years of experience working in their respective topic areas. And also they can be powerful trust brokers for communities. As I said, they're part of the in-group usually, so they already have very deep, trustful connections that can be used to be more effective in work. The subject matter leaders, on the other hand, are probably more mainstream as they provide evidence-based knowledge, so they collect data and evidence systematically. They have these information peer-reviewed. They engage with cause and effect of the work, and they apply rational and academic rigor in that. So with all that, they create a conceptual understanding of the issues at hand and provide pathways to make sense and to find levers that actually work. On the next page, we have the model that we use to conceptualize the practical implementation of what we've been talking about in the report. So we adapted the LEB model of Generation Pledge. So it's the look, envision, build model. So we have first the look with courage phase, where the individual would reflect on their own resources, on their status in the world, on how they relate to the world. before they come up with a vision for how they would like to engage with a better world. Ideally, the vision part has two parts. First of all, you need a vision for how a better world could look like. That's usually best done in combination with expert and proximate leaders. And second, you would need a vision for how you can best engage before you then go to the last step, which would be build with excellence, where you actually bring that to life and start building. That's like a very short wrap up. What you would use as part of that would be the aforementioned 4 types of capital. So like kind of identifying where your influence actually comes from, how to apply it, and therefore you will also start reflecting on yourself. Now, if you want to have more details, it's best to read the report. This is just a very short wrap up, and I'm going to hand over now to Jeru Bilemoria, who's going to present the social entrepreneurship perspective. Thank you, Jeru.
Thank you, Paul. Firstly, thank you to you and to McKinsey for your continued support and this annual partnership that we have. It's been a wonderful experience working with all the partners in this report who have made this possible. And I would also like to thank all the highly resourced net worth individuals who contributed, gave their ideas, gave their thoughts. The reason we thought of the report and the reason we think this is so important is because we as social entrepreneurs, and I'm speaking on behalf of the Catalyst community, which is basically a community of 1,600 plus social entrepreneurs and innovators, which works closely with Ashoka, Skoll, Schwab, and Echoing Green. We call them our own Big Four. All of us came together and all of us thought this report was really essential for 3 main reasons. One, like Liza mentioned earlier, only if we will work together will we be able to solve some of the most pressing challenges. And Catalyst has come together to be able to make sure we actually achieve the SDGs by 2030 as compared to 2094 as is currently being said. So A, we need to work with everybody, we need to work together, and that's why we need to work with the highly resourced networked individuals to make this happen. So that's the first reason. Secondly, we really believe that through this report, and one of the most important things is if you work in partnership with different mindsets, we will be able to leverage our assets to be able to make change happen faster. And we have seen that when we work with highly resourced individuals at country levels, we've been able to accelerate the change. A very, very small example, but we have awards. We have, and my colleague Karen and Brad are there. Last year we had awards, and one of our finalists who came with us was from Brazil. And he basically loved what we were doing and worked with the Brazil chapter to get it off the ground and to resource it, but also to give it the necessary connections and links. And today our Brazil chapter is a really strong, thriving chapter which is taking place. So through collaborations, not just financial, yeah, thanks, sorry. Yeah, so again, if we combine our resources, we are able to work faster. So that's the second reason. And I think the third reason is basically values. What I have noticed is when we work with highly resourced individuals, we are both able to align on values. And when you align on values and when you create bonds, then you're able to accelerate change much, much faster. So thanks to Ashoka, I'm currently talking to a bunch of highly resourced individuals in the tech sector in Europe. And all of them are really seeing how they can align and then learn with and work from and accelerate the change in Europe. But why does it have to be in Europe? Why can't it be through the whole world? This report, I think, is a stepping stone to really start collaborating, co-creating, and making the change that we have and want to see happen. With this, I will hand over back to Odin to take us forward.
And the next step would be to learn about how co-conspiracy can look like in practice. And with that, I hand it over to Marina and Farhad for the fireside chat.
Thank you so much, Odin, everybody, for being here. It's a huge pleasure. And while I was preparing for this moment here, I read about Farhad, and we have this common denominator. Both of us were interviewed in the report, which is a huge honor. And I was very impressed, Farhad, by your story, by things that you went through internally and the decisions, how they reflected in practice. So it's a real honor being here, asking you questions from a place of a peer, from a place of a professional, because I'm also one of the co-founders of Generation Pledge. So it means a lot to be here with all of you and with you, Farhad. So the way that I structured the interview is using the LEB model, which Generation Pledge felt very honored that this was the model that was used to structure a lot of the conversations in the report. So I want to use this framework to ask you the questions, Farhad. So the first question is really the piece on looking with courage. And this speaks about how do we look into the world, how do we look into ourselves, and how do we relate both of them. But I want to highlight the conversation on internal leaps that we have to go through. So what have you had to go internally in your life? What did you have to change to be able to get to the place where you are, where you're so certain, committed about reducing risks, creating more flourishing lives, more shared prosperity, preventing suffering? Like, what did you have to go through internally to get to this point? Oh, you're muted, Farhad. Yeah.
I think after 2 years, I'd know to unmute myself. Thank you very much for that question. I'm excited that we're using the framework from the report to structure this interview. I think one thing that's worth naming is what I came into these reflections with, which is, I grew up here in the United States with 2 refugee parents, my father from Iran and my mom grew up in Cuba. And on one hand, I'm the lefty straight out of central casting in my family, the teenager who was haranguing my parents about why we didn't talk about class and capitalism more. But on the other hand, I'm very much of my family in the sense that I grew up in the 80s in a time where I couldn't watch the news with my parents without them expressing candidly some rather strong opinions about US foreign policy. And when I asked them questions about this and how this connected to their respective experiences in Iran and Cuba, what it really came down to is the importance of community self-determination and the importance of questions of power and who gets to make decisions on behalf of whom. And so that was a seed of a lens or a politic that I had, that as I grew older, and as my family's financial situation became much more clear to me, I think I had the kind of reaction to being, told what money existed in the family, told what money had been put in my name, that, a lot of lefty straight out of central casting family members have, right? Where my initial reaction was one of discomfort and of avoidance. But I think what was very helpful to me was that period where I saw that an approach, because I was already convinced it was sort of I was preloaded, as you might suggest, to want to redistribute the resources, but I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know how to approach philanthropy with a politic. And I think that seed of values around community self-determination and questions of power is what helped me navigate. So I think I went through a period where I was trying to practice philanthropy as I was being advised to do so. And, as a living donor, it's suggested pick an issue, pick a way of measuring it, and then pick a strategy to move the needle. And then honestly, folks treat grantees like service providers to implement their strategies. That never quite sat well with me. But it wasn't until I started to connect with more folks, both radicals in philanthropy and folks from the grassroots organizing sector, that I heard about different approaches to issues that, you know, in my case, the foundation I started was intended to focus on climate initially, realizing that, you know, climate's not actually a question of policy or technology or science. It's a question of power. It's a question of political will. And hearing folks from community organizing groups and social movement formations articulate climate in that way was like a breath of fresh air for me. It allowed me to sort of let go of this line of inquiry around, you know, top-down strategic philanthropy, where I was trying to seem like the smartest person in the room because I had to, right? Because I had all this power and privilege, and I was able to allocate resources accordingly, and go back into what was actually for me a much more politically comfortable frame of bottom-up community self-determination. And then it became a question of, okay, what's my role as a philanthropist, as a funder, in supporting that kind of bottom-up community self-determination?
Really interesting, Farhad. If you were maybe to identify one change that had to happen for you to be comfortable in owning your story, getting into this place of thank you, of working with system change and trust-based relationship, what had to change internally within you so that you did that?
I think it was a realization that philanthropy could be approached as something that was highly relational and based on building trust and open and honest and vulnerable relationships, and not something that had to be based on academic expertise. And so realizing that I did not have to become an issue expert, right, in any area where I wanted to support, you know, transformative change efforts. But what I did have to do was become very good at approaching things with radical humility and building open and honest and trusting relationships with folks who were doing this work. And so in a way, it was a very liberating realization that I did not have to take a different path that I saw other folks taking. But there was a point in time up until that realization where I thought that's what I had to do. And if I wasn't doing it, I wasn't doing a very good job.
Very interesting. This will take us to the second question, which is on how to envision with rigor. So the second phase, it talks about how to imagine a better future. And it really puts us in a place of considering how do we become more effective change agents? And then we have the two types of leaders, the proximate leaders and the subject matter leaders. So what I want to ask you is, how did you go about understanding what had to change in systems so that the changes that were needed really happened? So how did you learn about systems, and how did you develop your vision to understand what had to happen?
So I think there's maybe two lines of inquiry that I was involved in simultaneously, although I don't necessarily mean to say that consciously, like this is what I would have told you at the time. The one that was probably more conscious to me was the line of inquiry in the day-to-day work of the foundation in terms of moving from that issue focus around climate to a broader frame around power. And I think what we saw and what we learned was, and you know, I should say to contextualize this, Skoll Foundation is a domestic foundation in the United States. So I think we have a internationalist orientation, but the work that we have supported, the work that we've built relationships with, is all happening in the United States. And it was very clear to us as we were learning in the first few years of the foundation how much the landscape of power was fundamental to the question of getting the right kind of climate policy and climate solutions in the United States. That we had, obviously, I think to those of us now looking back, the lack of organized political power on behalf of the climate movement in the United States, but also the tremendous economic power of the fossil fuel industry. And perhaps more important than either of the other two, but often overshadowed, was the cultural power of business as usual, including in places where business had been done that way for a long time. And so, you know, people in the United States would talk about, oh, the coal industry is not that big anymore. And yet the coal industry had a tremendous amount of cultural power in places where that had been what had given people good jobs for generations. And so that was a shift from, it was sort of a theory of change shift, right? In terms of we're not going to support the right kinds of transformations by having the best solutions as an offering. We're going to be able to do that if we actually build the power to implement the solutions. That the not having the right policy has not been the bottleneck. That actually getting it implemented and not just passing it at the federal level, but then getting it implemented at the local level is the bottleneck. So I think that was a shift for me in terms of, it was less of an outcome shift and more of a process shift. If we want to get to this world, we have to think about who it takes and at what tables to get there. But at the same time, I mentioned before that I entered into philanthropy with a fundamental discomfort, right, with the wealth, but it hadn't been politicized yet. I wouldn't say I was coming at that from an ideological perspective. And when I say ideology, that's not a dirty word to me. I believe everybody is ideological, and it's just a question of naming and owning our ideological orientations. But for me, it was, to be blunt, more of an emotional thing at the beginning. And I think what has become crystal clear to me, and this is part of what my response to the report is, I'm thinking about Liza's remarks, and that this is not just a role for me, it's a responsibility, right? The fact that I am so highly resourced is actually part of the problem. The fact that I have this outsized influence is actually part of the problem. And so to me, thinking about, I believe the social movement slogan that another world is possible, part of believing that for me and part of being a co-conspirator is not just saying, oh, in another world, we could have environmental justice, we could have housing justice, even we could abolish the police and prisons. Part of me is saying that perspective of abolition is also something that I apply to the question of private philanthropy. And so I believe that part of this role and responsibility is to challenge the root conditions that have resourced me so disproportionately, that have handed this amount of influence to me in the first place. And that was, I think, to me, part of it's part of the theory of change that implicates myself, right? Like that at best, what I can do is a transitional form in a world that is governed by a set of rules that we're trying to change, right? So in that sense, I talk a lot about the role of a radical philanthropist is to try to put oneself out of business, where we can imagine a world in which we don't have this kind of influence anymore, and where nobody does, because the resources are not extracted and consolidated in the first place.
That is so interesting. Farhad, you've been talking about your theory of change, and I just want to highlight, we will not have time to deepen the conversation of this, but you've developed something that we see missing in the ecosystem, which is what comes after a theory of change. For people who are highly resourced individuals, what is their theory of wealth? And you went through a lot of thoughts before you defined your theory of wealth. And this took you to a place where you committed to giving most of your wealth away. So I just want to make sure to highlight that it's not only important to think about theory of change, but also think about how this creates a theory of wealth. And looking, were you going to say something?
Oh, I was going to say, not most, all of it.
All of your wealth, yeah.
Yes.
I didn't want to take the risk of overstating, but you said that. Amazing. Congratulations. Very few people have the boldness to go there. And thinking about how to build with excellence, we know that this is the place where our intentions really are brought to life. So we're all very interested in making sure that whatever we do have practical results. And when we're working with system change, many times the change is not visible and it does not happen fast. So the time frame for results is larger, it's more extended. So how do you build a thesis to know that what you're doing works?
I think it comes back to this question of processes versus outcomes. I think there's a very established and in some cases appropriate, right, approach to systemic change that really focuses on the outcomes, and always believes that there is a clear path, right, that you can see every step of the way to get to those outcomes. But I think for the work that the Chorus Foundation aims to support, and the work that our grantees do, which is, very place-based transformative work that is thinking about building political, economic, and cultural power and the relationship between those three things. And so the level of complexity and patience that folks have to sit in to do that work means that it can take, 5 to 10 years to start to see what's emerging. And so I think part of what it takes to support this kind of work, I think first and foremost is trusting that folks know what they're doing. Now that trust doesn't mean that we can't have conversations about how do we understand and learn from the work. I do think there's an approach to, conventional top-down strategic philanthropy that's very invested in questions of metrics and evaluation, very invested in being able to say up front what success is supposed to look like for a specific grant-making program. I think what we've tried to do, and what we're always learning how to do better, is to decouple form and function for some of these conversations around metrics and evaluation, clear goals, and mile markers for success. And to say, if at the end of the day, what we're really trying to do is to learn from and understand our grantees' work. And in our case, we make long-term general operating commitments. And by long-term, I mean 8 to 10 years. So we're not trying to learn from and understand their work because we're making funding decisions around it anymore. Like, our grantees already know that they get funded by the foundation every year until the foundation runs out of money, which it will as a spend down foundation in another 18 months. But what we can do is engage our grantees in conversation where we're asking them, how do they learn from and understand their own work? Because I think this is one of the really paternalistic fallacies that can happen in mainstream philanthropy, is this idea that our grantees aren't already measuring and evaluating themselves, that we come with these new, imposed ideas of like, well, we want to see this, we want to see that, we want to make sure you're doing this. And it becomes our grantees' jobs to become fluent in the way each one of their funders wants them to understand and evaluate their own work, as opposed to the reverse, right? As opposed to, as a funder, my job is to have intellectual fluency, cultural competency, etc., in the actual work of each of our grantees, right? It puts the onus on me to understand all of that. So we have that orientation, but I wouldn't say that our 8 to 10 year funding commitments surfaced like very clear, like, this is what's going to happen at year 3. This is what's going to happen at year 5. This is what's going to happen at year 10. I think what we really believed in, and I'm speaking past tense, right, because we're so close to spending down, is the ideas of emergence and iteration, that if we approach things in ways where we're building open and honest and vulnerable relationships, then we will get the kind of candid feedback from our grantees that allow us to iterate and shift. And for a lot of that iteration is around democratized decision making. How are we creating the conditions so that community organizations and community members can be the ones making decisions about where resources go? And I will say that's not just important for us as a foundation while we exist. That's part of the vision. That's part of what we're trying to, folks are already building this, and we're just trying to be supportive of that, because those mechanisms for democratic resource allocation, those mechanisms for cooperative, non-extractive finance, those things will exist after the foundation is gone. Those things will exist after I have redistributed all my wealth. And we see ourselves as helping our grantees build the kind of mechanisms for resource and allocation and investment that ought to exist in that other world if it's possible. So I'm radical enough to say that I don't think private philanthropy should exist at all in the world that we want to build, but I'm not saying resource allocation would no longer be a question, right? And so we believe we're supporting our grantees to exercise those muscles, to co-design those processes, so that what will be what continues to exist in those communities even after Chorus Foundation is gone.
Farhad, thank you so much. I could, and I imagine that most of us could stay additional 2 hours listening to you. Thank you so much for the way that you brought your why, your what, your how, really opening with such clarity. And I hope that this has been a lot of food for thought. And I'll pass it now to Woden so that he can take us to the breakout sessions. Thank you so much, Farhad. It was a huge pleasure listening to you.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here.
And Farhad, and we will come back to you after a little reflection exercise. Now, for those of you who enjoyed this conversation, do read the report, because we have profiles of many more highly resourced individuals with very bold strategies and actions similarly motivated. For now, though, I would like to remind all of us that we all probably, like on a global frame of reference, belong to the most highly resourced individuals too. Maybe not, the billionaires that we interviewed for the report, but still, we might only be part of the top 1 or 5%, but still, we can basically ask ourselves similar questions to the ones that we outlined in the report. And this is what I would like us to do right now. We will be sending you in a few moments into breakout sessions of 3 people each. And you don't need to introduce yourself. You just you're invited to share 3 minutes each, whatever comes to mind spontaneously regarding the following 2 questions. First, which type of capital could I use even more? Now, in the discussion, we focused on using financial capital in the form of a foundation, but remember that we are looking also at social capital, political capital, career capital that you get by having an important position in a company, or by having visibility, or by being able to shift public discourse. So just think for a moment, which of those assets you could use even more to promote systems change? And then ask yourself, which ethical question should I keep in mind? Or how should I approach this work so that I wield my influence in a responsible way? Now, those are big questions. 3 minutes will not be enough to answer them, but just to see what comes to mind spontaneously for each of you. So with that, I hand it over to our to the technical management of this whole session to see if we could create breakouts with 3 people each. See you all back here in 10 minutes.
All right, so welcome back, everybody. We hope that this was a fruitful and insightful session, having space to talk like in smaller groups. I would like to invite if someone wants to bring a reflection, something that stood out, something that felt important. And I think we'll have time for 1 person sharing only. Let's see if there is anyone courageous enough to do this now. Okay. So maybe, Odin, I'll pass it back to you then, because we do have a hard stop in the session. So please, if you want to take it from here and do the wrap up of the session, that would be great.
All right. So let's stay true to our announcement that this would only take 1 hour. Wrap up the session here. We will stay on though. So if you do want to talk to any of the speakers, Farhad, or just share what you reflected in the breakout sessions, please feel free to do so. But just to make sure that that people can leave when we told them they can leave.